Good evening and afternoon, everyone. This is Dewana Nicole with Advancement Project, and I just want to welcome you to our webinar on restorative justice, full school implementation, restorative language, and culture. Tonight, I also have with me Allison Meyer from Denver Public Schools, who is one of the restorative practices coordinators there, and she is going to open this webinar with a reading. Allison?
Thanks, Dewana. This reading is from Brene Brown's The Gifts of Imperfection. Practicing courage, compassion, and connection in our daily lives is how we cultivate worthiness. The key word is practice. Mary Daly, a theologian, writes, "Courage is like, it's a habitus, a habit, a virtue. You get it by courageous acts. It's like you learn to swim by swimming. You learn courage by couraging." The same is true for compassion and connection. We invite compassion into our lives when we act compassionately towards ourselves and others, and we feel connected in our lives when we reach out and connect.
Thank you, Allison. Tonight's webinar is being brought to you in partnership with the Denver School-Based Restorative Practices Partnership, which is a coalition of racial justice organizing groups, teachers unions, and Denver Public Schools, where we have sought to provide resources to educators to assist them with implementation of restorative justice. Just a few things about our partnership. In Denver Public Schools, they do use the term restorative practices. As a lot of you know, at the national level, NEA and Advancement Project use the term restorative justice, so we tried to use the term restorative justice practices in this webinar, but in case you see the difference in language, that is the reason for that. These webinars go along with an implementation guide that we released earlier this year on whole school implementation of restorative justice. Tonight's particular webinar on restorative language and culture is something that really encompasses the entire guide. This idea that if you want to have a restorative school, then part of the work also needs to be making sure that your language is actually matching up what you want to see in the building, that your policies and procedures are also restorative along with your actions. Allison is going to go through the webinar, and after the webinar is over, after the slides are finished, we will take questions. If you are on your phone, as in on an app, on your smartphone, or if you are logging in from your computer, you can type your questions in the chat box and we will get to you. Unfortunately, if you just called in with your cell phone only, we are not able to unmute you to take your question. And so for those of you who may be on your cell phone or at work calling in, if you have a question after the webinar, please text me. If you receive an email from me, then you have my cell phone number, so please send me a text message and we will answer your question on the webinar. So Allison, we can get started.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not have the screen pulled up, Dewana. I'm still seeing the white screen, so I don't know if our listeners are as well. Oh, there we go.
You have it now?
I do. Thank you. Thanks. So yeah, as Dewana said, restorative language and culture certainly encompasses a lot of what it means to be a restorative school. In our implementation guide, which I believe most of you probably have a copy of at this point, it is specifically one of the benchmarks that we speak to. So it's benchmark 5, restorative language and culture have been established. But I think as we see with most of these benchmarks, they all kind of bleed together. And so really everything else kind of fits under the idea of restorative language and culture existing in a building. And so what you can kind of expect for the webinar today is I'm going to walk you through, we'll start with language. I think language and culture really coexist in a lot of ways, but we'll start specifically talking about language, and we'll look at what we see as punitive language versus restorative. And we'll do the same for culture, punitive culture versus restorative. And then we'll talk a little bit about what it means to kind of live in the middle of punitive and restorative, which I think is where most of our schools and probably most of us as educators are. And then we'll talk about some concrete strategies for then how you move closer to being a fully restorative school, both in language and culture. So to start, I wanted to start with talking a little bit about what punitive language we oftentimes see in schools. So first of all, just if the people in a school are unfamiliar with the restorative values or the restorative questions that might be used in the case of conflict, like what happened, who was impacted, what part can you take responsibility for, and how do we fix this relationship? In a punitive setting, you would see that those are not commonly known or used by staff members, and I would also add students and their families to that as well. I think the way we name spaces can be really powerful in a building, and so if you are walking through a school that is still naming spaces in a way that reflects a punitive mindset, like there is a detention room or a suspension room or like a discipline office, I think until we kind of like re-norm what we think of as discipline, that could have a very negative connotation for a student that's being sent to something that's labeled that way. Likewise, we also want to be very intentional with the names of interventions, and I think in a lot of places we still see that the names of the interventions reflect a punitive mindset. And so detention, after school detention, lunch detention, Saturday detention, suspension, anything along those lines that really reflects like you're being punished and you're being sent out of our community. I think sometimes like timeouts can be framed that way as well, as this you are not welcome, and thinking about how powerful that language is for a student to hear, I'm not welcome in this community. I think as far as language goes, it's also the language that we hear our educators using when they're talking about students or when they're talking about the families of their students. And so if you hear a lot of deficit language, and I would add to that that you also see that that deficit language is going unchecked by others in the school community. And so I can just give an example from one of the schools I work with. They recently started integrating into their interview questions. They ask the person to respond to the following question. They say, fill in the blank of the following statement. These kids can't. And then say how you would respond if you heard another educator use that language. And so what they're encouraging the candidates that they're interviewing for their staff to do is really think about when are these times that you hear deficit-based language, and how are you speaking out to make sure that doesn't become part of the school culture, and to make sure that stops with maybe that one frustrated teacher or that one frustrated staff member, and doesn't turn meetings or conversations about students into places where we shame and blame. I would also echo just the language that is used around behavior. If you hear students being referred to as bad or problematic, or students are in trouble or misbehaving, that definitely reflects a school that is prioritizing rule following versus a school that's looking at behavior as a form of communication. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to talking about those strategies to kind of build the capacity for restorative language in a school building. And so on the flip side of that, when we think about restorative language, we think about, first of all, you hear teachers, students, family members using those restorative questions when faced with conflict or concern. The use of affective statements, I feel this way when I see this behavior or when you do this in our community, are commonly known and used by all members of the school community, both in formal and informal spaces. I always think it's really powerful when I'm in some of the schools that I work with and I hear, a student coming to an adult to express concern about something that's happening in the building, and I hear the student using the language of, I took responsibility for this, but they won't take responsibility for this. And so you can tell that that language is being used so frequently in that building that the students are picking up on it, and that is the way that they express concern around conflict, or the way that they bring adult attention to conflict. In a lot of those same schools, I see that the name of the spaces in the building really reflect that restorative mindset. So maybe you see a peace room or a restorative office. I recently was in a school that has a space called PAWS, P-A-W-S, which it can be both both like obviously you need to take a pause, maybe you need to take a break, but it stands for, and I should have positive, and now I can't remember what it stands for. I'll go back to that. I see also places where the names of interventions really reflect that restorative mindset. So instead of after school detention, maybe a student is going to after school support. Maybe instead of lunch detention, it's a lunch intervention. And it's a space where they're spending time with the teacher with whom they need to work on building a relationship. Educators use asset-based language when discussing students, and so we see kind of like that asset-based and that solutions-based mentality. I had the opportunity to go to a school recently that was discussing, it was a meeting around students of concern, and when discussing a particular student who was suspected of abusing drugs, one educator used the word addict. And I saw educators around the room really push back on the use of that word of like, who are we to label this student an addict? And you know, when we label that student, that creates like a very different conversation. And so just like the fact that the educators in that space were really mindful of how we talk about students and the labels that we place on students. Educators discuss student behavior as opposed to misbehavior, and students are told interventions are means of support and not a consequence for being in trouble. I think this is really powerful if we stop using the phrase misbehavior, because I think all behavior is just that, it is a form of communication, and that way it helps us look at challenging behavior as a means of communicating unmet needs. And I think the language that we use to talk about that can be a really powerful first step in shifting the mindset around the way that we look at behavior. The signage in the building also promotes the use of restorative language. At a couple middle schools I work in, they have the restorative questions posted around the school in spaces where conflict typically happens. And so maybe at recess or near the lunchroom, so that if students are in a conflict, there are signs everywhere promoting them to kind of have the conversation about, you know, what part can you take responsibility for, who's being impacted, how can we fix this? And I recently was working with an elementary school that had a really creative idea of, they took a large piece of butcher paper and put footprints along it, and they called it a peace walk. And students stand facing each other with their feet in the traced out footprints. And when they're standing in the footprints and they look down, there's a sentence stem for them to use to have a restorative conversation. And so as the conversation progresses, they move their feet along this little walk, and they have new sentence stems to help them really facilitate that conversation themselves. And I saw 2 second grade students go through this process where they bumped into each other during class. It was starting to escalate, and so the teacher said, why don't you two go participate in a peace walk? And the students were able to go over, and they had the language to be able to have that conversation by themselves without the teacher needing to step away from the classroom. And so I wanted to put these pieces side by side for you to look at. So you can kind of think about, where does your school fall on the spectrum about the way that you're using language when talking about students, when naming spaces, when naming interventions, possibly when naming certain positions in your building. We see a lot of times students, especially at the high school level, might have a negative connotation with the label dean. And so I've seen some schools talk instead about a student advisor. And that a lot of ways can make that person more approachable, and the students more willing to open up to that individual. I think while you're maybe looking at these two things side by side, other things worth talking about is just in general the power of the language that we use. I know Advancement Project some time ago created a document that really highlighted some common language that they hear being used in schools that we really need to get away from. For example, calling our students of color minority students really robs them of a sense of power. And so talking about students as students of color rather than minority students. Personally, as a former classroom teacher, I had to be very conscious about no longer using like the term sweetie or honey for my female students. In a lot of ways, I felt like that I was talking down to them when I used that language, and so really working on my own self-awareness about when I slipped into that language. Same with, I had a tendency to, as a whole group, say like you guys, and kind of working on the gender dynamics of my language. And then personally, I taught U.S. history when I was a teacher, and I always found it very easy to kind of talk to my students about history as like almost telling a story. But it meant that sometimes I fell into a trap of saying we when I was talking about like the United States, for example, and just recognizing that for a lot of my students, like me saying we when speaking from like the perspective of the United States government, like a lot of my students felt marginalized and oppressed by the United States government. And so being conscious about like my use of pronouns in spaces as well. And so I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about culture now. And like I said, these things are very intertwined, but I just wanted to separate them for this first part so that we can really think about like the way language drives culture and the way culture drives language. And so as far as what we would expect to see in a punitive school, as far as punitive culture goes, educators are not greeting students. They're not seen having restorative conversations in the school building throughout the day. I think typically when you walk through a school building that is punitive, you're going to hear like yelling and reprimanding. And so like the tone and the voice levels of educators reflect a punitive and shaming environment. And I would also add to that the posturing. I think I see that a lot in schools, and especially schools with some of our smaller students with like elementary and middle school, of like the typical teacher with like hands on hips kind of like towering over and posturing with the student. And I think in a lot of ways that can escalate student behavior. Educators are unable or unwilling to discuss the impact that race has in their decision making. And I think a lot of times, like in a school that has punitive culture, that those conversations are just non-existent in general, of just no one's talking about race. Student reputations dictate how they are treated in school. Tim Turley, who is the other district coordinator here for restorative practices in Denver Public Schools, always tells a story of he was called into a school building to facilitate a training on some restorative language that teachers could use in the classroom. And while waiting in the main office, he saw a teacher get her class list for the year for the first time, and heard her like going through the students and say, "Oh no, not him." And just thinking about like what are we setting our students up for if we're allowing reputations for them to dictate the way that they are treated in school. That teacher had yet to see that student and that teacher had yet to build a relationship with one another. That student could have done a lot of growing over the previous couple of months over the summer break, and just that student already kind of had a barrier in place of just that teacher was already looking at them as a bad kid or a problem child. The climate of the room in which students are sent from class is punitive. I've seen this is so typical, and I know a lot of it has to do with just we have to be creative with the space that we have in school buildings, but typically the room where students are sent for breaks from class, like oftentimes I feel like those rooms have no windows, nothing is hung on the walls, and I think that can really send a message to students of just like this is the space that we put students we don't care about in. We don't care about this room, and so we don't care about the students that need to use this room. Students and their families, and sometimes educators, do not have a voice in school policies and procedures. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you can build this capacity and how you can really make sure that those students, families, and educators do have a voice in the school policies and procedures that you're establishing. And I think it kind of goes hand in hand with that next bullet point of if you're not giving students and their families and educators voice in creating these rules, most likely it means that your focus is simply on rule following, and that rules are designed with only the best interest of the staff or maybe even school leadership in mind, and not students or their families. I think a common area of contention that I can think about around this kind of like rule following mentality and creating rules with the adults in mind and not with the students in mind. I saw frequently with the design of bathroom break systems. I've been in multiple schools where like bathroom breaks were a thing that became hard to manage, and so the immediate response was just no more bathroom breaks for students, which I think we recognize does not put students first, or really really it doesn't serve students in any way or really serve teachers. It's just a way of just like, this is something that's difficult for us to manage, so let's just make it so students can't take bathroom breaks. And I've been in schools where that then created a lot of tension between staff and students because staff were put in a position to enforce such a rule, and then students were frequently upset by the fact that they weren't able to, in a lot of ways, meet a basic human need. And so what the flip side of this coin looks like is if you're in a building where you see educators greeting students, there's a great video of Skinner Middle School where the social worker Joe Walden is standing outside and greeting every student by name as they come into the school building. And that is something at that school that happens every day, and part of that is because they systematize it. And community building is given very high priority in that school to the point that there are adults that are assigned that duty of standing outside and saying hello to every student when they walk into the building, and that student, staff members, any families, any visitors that enter that school community. The tone and voice levels of educators reflect a caring and supportive environment. Obviously, we want to provide the space for individual educator personality, and I think that can look different coming from different educators. One of the schools I work with, they frequently talk about how they have a couple of staff that come from military backgrounds, and so their tone and voice level might be a little different when they're being caring and supportive, but that's kind of where that relationship piece is really important, so that the students understand that, like, you know, this teacher might feel like he's yelling at me, but I also have a relationship with this teacher to know that this is caring and supportive language and tone and voice level. All members of the school community are comfortable discussing the impact race has in decision making and conflict. And these conversations are happening regularly. And it's I think talking about race is a muscle that needs to be exercised, and so that it's something that is common in the school building, so that if someone else came in and started a conversation about race, you don't see blank faces from all the educators, because this is not something that they typically do. It's something that is a regular part of their practice. The room in which students are sent from class is actually designed to facilitate breaks and build social, emotional, and conflict resolution skills. Just as far as like design goes, I was in an elementary school that had their peace room had lava lamps everywhere, which I thought was interesting. And then 2 students came in that had just gotten into like a physical fight in the hallways. And it was really helpful for them to just kind of stare at the lava lamps. They were very calming for them. I've seen schools that have like essential oil diffusers or beanbag chairs, so students can have a couple different options about where they sit, and just spaces for them to be able to calm down and decompress. And then I think also what they're doing in that space. So rather than if a student is spending an extended amount of time in some sort of in-school intervention room, rather than spending that time like doing a packet that their teacher sent so they don't get behind on schoolwork, they're actually engaging in conversation with an adult about the behavior that got them into that room or the troubles that they're having in their class academically. And there are probing questions happening to kind of figure out what is the root cause and how can we fix what is the reason that you aren't in class right now. I think a lot of times too, the person that's designated to supervise that space can be very telling. Sometimes it might just be, you know, whoever's available in that moment, and sometimes it's somebody who comes from like a social emotional background and is going to be able to really reach students on that level. Somebody who can relate to the students, who looks like the students that are in the building, to be able to give students that space and that comfort level to be able to talk about what they might be experiencing in the community or at home that might be impacting them in school. Students, their families, and educators have a voice in school policies and procedures, and those are designed in response to student needs. And I would also say that those are designed in an age and developmentally appropriate way. I think I walk into a lot of schools that has higher expectations for their 6th graders than most places would have of adults in a building. And so really making sure that we're thinking about like developmentally where our students are at, and is it actually realistic that students would enter a classroom in a single file line, voice level 0, and remain at voice level 0 for the first 20 minutes of class when they haven't seen their friends in 3 days. And so also making sure that our expectations are designed in response to student needs and are that developmental level appropriate. I worked in a school once where even the school's schedule was causing some issues in the school community. It was a very long school day compared to neighboring schools, and there were a lot of behavior concerns kind of coming up at the end of the school day. And I think, as we all know, a lot of times adults are contributing to that just as much, if not more, than students. And I think it was just like pure exhaustion at the end of the day from students and from staff. And then there was also some concern brought up from families that the very long school schedule was impacting them being able to pick up students that went to other neighboring schools. And so in the middle of the semester, the school sent out an email saying, like, we are completely changing our school schedule because we have heard from students, their families, and educators that this school schedule is causing problems. And so they shortened the school day, they changed the order of the classes, they created some block scheduling to accommodate science teachers that wanted to have labs. And just, it was a great example of a school just completely upending a school policy mid-year because it wasn't working and it wasn't meeting the needs of students. I also think if you're in a building that has restorative culture, you're going to see that mentality of every day you come into my classroom is a new day and every class you go to is a new class. And so student reputation is not dictating the way that they are treated in class, or what happened yesterday that might not have gone so well doesn't mean that I care about teaching you any less, or I care about having you in this space any less, or that you are any less a part of our community. And I think at the high school and middle school level, that can also translate from class to class throughout a school day. Just because you had a bad day in first period doesn't mean we can't bounce back from that starting in second period. And so making sure that that culture of shaming is replaced with a culture of support and grace, giving people grace in the ability to make mistakes and rebound back from them. And so again, just kind of just look at them side by side and think a little bit about where your school might fall on the spectrum of restorative culture. Like I said, restorative language and restorative culture definitely go hand in hand. I think one of the best ways to work on strengthening restorative language is to be in a space where you feel comfortable, like being able to call out fellow adults in your building about the language that they are using and the impact it has on students. And I don't think that's an easy thing to do if you also don't have some elements of restorative culture in place. And so language and culture, I think, really go hand in hand, but it's just helpful to kind of think of them at first as these two separate entities. And so moving on to our next slide, I think where most of us probably live just as educators, and most schools probably are, is just somewhere in the middle of restorative and punitive language and restorative and punitive culture. And so some of the common pitfalls that I see when I'm in schools or that I've heard from other educators or students or families are listed here on this slide. And so a lot of the times you'll hear that, like, restorative dialogue is used, for example, when there is conflict that arises. But the intent of that dialogue is lecturing the student rather than actually really trying to understand the root cause of their behavior and to help them understand, or to help the adult understand, the impact that the behavior is having on the larger school community. I think something I warn schools against that I've seen happening more and more frequently is that those kinds of restorative questions are actually written on a reflection sheet. And so if a student does something in class, they're just given that form to fill out, and then that's considered the, like, restorative conversation. Whereas obviously what we really want to see is that dialogue happening and, like, an authentic back and forth conversation where both adult and student are taking responsibility for their behavior and how it might have impacted the other party and the bigger classroom community. I think in a lot of those spaces you also see that, like, you know, even though the teacher is asking what happened and helping have the conversation around impact and responsibility, that at the end of the conversation the teacher still just assigns a consequence. And perhaps the same consequence for every student, or maybe there's a rigid consequence ladder that is followed. And so you don't see the students ever really having any input in what the repair to the community will actually look like. And I'd say one of the a very common thing I see, and especially at the classroom teacher level, is that the resolution is always an apology. Okay, so you've disrupted our class, so the resolution is you will apologize to the class. And I think we have to be really careful about that. One, because I think apologies can be really empty for a lot of people. I think it's not very trauma sensitive as well. I think students or staff members that come from a cycle of abuse are very used to being apologized to and then having that behavior continue to be carried out with that towards them. And so I think a lot of times that can like put us in this little pitfall where like you might be going through the motions of using restorative language, but the intent and the outcome isn't actually restorative. Restorative justice practices are seen as just something adults do to students. So if you think of that social discipline window, the point of restorative practices is that it is done with the community and not to any part of the community. And so I've been in spaces where restorative practices are only ever used for student to student or student to teacher conflict. And then when they're used for student to educator conflict, adults are rarely taking responsibility for how their own behavior might have contributed to the student behavior. And so definitely making sure that, you know, just because you're using restorative justice practices doesn't necessarily mean that you've really empowered students to have voice. And it might require going back to really think about, am I using restorative justice practices with fidelity? A lot of times that we see in schools, and this is definitely something that Denver has really struggled with, restorative justice practices are only used in response to behavior and they're not used proactively. When Denver Public Schools first rolled out restorative practices, the purpose of it was to reduce the amount of the huge amount of suspensions that was currently happening in the district. There was lots of suspensions, lots of expulsions, plenty of tickets for students being ticketed, and then there were gross racial disparities. And so because restorative justice practices were rolled out with that intention, typically in schools they were just seen as something you do to students once they've been referred to an office, or something that is done instead of a suspension, as almost like a diversion program. And what we're seeing now is that because they were rolled out in that way, that we're kind of having to backtrack and make sure that schools understand that restorative justice is more about community building and relationship building. And that's where we really need to be focusing our attention. Very common, while race is occasionally discussed with staff, race is rarely discussed with students and their families. I was recently in a school, and as a white woman, I was teaching a class on like relationship building for a group of fourth graders that were primarily Black students. And I made a comment to one of the students about, you know, like, look at this crazy white lady standing up here. And I could tell that was the first time in a long time that an adult had acknowledged race and the difference in our races in a school that has primarily white educators and primarily Black students. And this isn't something that is commonly acknowledged in that building, just like by the look of pure surprise on that student's face. And so thinking about, like, are we not just talking about race in these staff meetings, but also are we talking about race with our students on a regular basis? Are we talking about race when our students are in conflict, and particularly when they might be in conflict with a teacher that doesn't look like them? And I also see, kind of, we talked about like the importance of labeling spaces. I've been in schools that have, like, again, taken this step to relabel a detention room as a peace room, but then still when you walk into that space, it's used as like a silent study hall, and it's very clearly like a place for punishment and shaming, and just think about what you did, but don't engage in conversation about it. And so this is where I think a lot of our schools and a lot of our educators really find themselves is, you know, we're taking those first steps of transforming, but we haven't had a full mindset shift. And so we're kind of living in this space that's part restorative and part punitive. And we need to really be taking those steps to become a fully restorative place. Which leads me to some strategies that I've seen successful in some spaces that are also outlined in our implementation guide, which, as Dwana mentioned, was created by like teachers unions, school practitioners, a community organization, administrators from the district. We have both local people here in Denver that have worked on this, and then national people that have contributed as well, to come up with what are some of those strategies that we could be using in order to build restorative language and culture in our schools. And so some of the places we start with language is simply just making sure that everywhere where you're talking about behavior and discipline in your school policies, that you are being very intentional about the language that you use. And so in messaging that's being sent out to families, perhaps your school has a school website or Facebook page or social media accounts, the staff handbook, the student handbook, the student planner, anywhere where behavior and discipline are being discussed, making sure that you're being really intentional around that language. And so I know a lot of schools have started putting in student agendas, which students, carry from class to class with them, the restorative questions. So they're posted everywhere around the building, and then they're posted in the student agenda so that if a student is in conflict, they have the language that they need to use to treat that conflict as a learning opportunity and an opportunity for growth. Taking out language that talks about misbehavior, infractions, offenses, and the way we talk about behavior in our schools. I know a lot of schools have started kind of sending a note home to parents with some of the messaging around restorative practices so that you can build that capacity in parents. I've seen some schools talking about, and I don't know if this has actually happened, but creating like magnets, for example, that would have some restorative language on them that parents could put on their refrigerator so that you kind of start to see that common language happening at home as well to really, really, really reinforce it. The renaming of spaces and roles and interventions as necessary. So maybe creating protocols that you want maybe creating new signs for the buildings that reflect the restorative values, ensuring that the environments of those spaces that students might use to take a break from class are actually calming rather than prison-like. I've seen some schools that, they do have to use the room that has no windows because that's the only space that they have in the building that's not a classroom. But I have seen people kind of like take the time to then like decorate that space, including one school that actually took posters and made fake windows that looked out into relaxing and calming places. So a fake window poster that looked out onto a beach, or things like that to make sure that that space could still be a calming space, even though given the restrictions of just what the building provided as far as space went. Modeling restorative language, and I think this can happen both from administration modeling for teachers and then teachers modeling for students and their families, but as much as possible showing what a productive conversation about race looks like, including admitting mistakes and asking questions around race, so that you can kind of begin to strengthen that muscle in your teachers and in your students to be able to have those productive conversations about race. The conversations around the impact of adult behavior, I think that can be really valuable for administrators to do, or teachers to do, just to model for one another what it looks like to take responsibility. I am a huge fan of just building sentence stems. And so we sent this out with the last webinar recording, but it's something we can certainly send again. But sentence stems for how you talk about students when you're having a conversation about a student of concern. I recently created a protocol for a school that was sentence stems for how to welcome a student back into a classroom after they've taken a break. They were really struggling with, a student's been sent out, and took a 20-minute break, and we're trying to facilitate getting that student back into the classroom. And before they're even back in the door and in their seat, they've already been asked to leave again because they didn't enter the room properly, or the teacher felt like there hadn't been a consequence, or that the student didn't understand the impact of their behavior. And so we created sentence stems and like a script for teachers about how do you actually welcome a student back into your classroom in an authentic way, in an enthusiastic way. And then if you're not following that protocol and that procedure and using that language, then this probably is less of a student problem and more of an adult problem that needs to be worked on. I think along with modeling that restorative language is also modeling modeling how to communicate about some of the challenges you might be having, or concerns you might have, or conflicts you might have personally. And so I've worked with schools that have, very set systems for how you communicate about a concern you're having. For example, one school, they called it C4 statements, CFOR. And if you had a concern, you communicated the concern, followed by how it made you feel, followed by a element of ownership. So what do you own about that concern? Followed by your request for the other person. And both students and teachers used that model for how you talk about concerns. And so it was just something that became very natural and part of the school culture. So as far as building restorative culture, and again, these things really go hand in hand, but using restorative justice practices with staff is always encouraged and typically a very good place to start, just because it's very hard to convince educators that this is something that is worthwhile doing with students unless they also feel respected and feel in relationship with the people that they work with. And so prioritizing relationship building and facilitating meetings or circles are just a couple of examples of how you can start to build that buy-in among your staff members. I talk a lot with schools about celebrating growth and success. And that growth is actually something that a lot of schools really struggle with celebrating, but how do we actually celebrate that in an authentic way? And so just to give you an example there, I was recently working at a middle school, and a student was screaming in the hallways, and I could see some staff members becoming very upset, and the restorative practices coordinator that I was working with just reminded the staff, remember, that's a long way from screaming the F word. And she told me later, the student was screaming the F word repeatedly, and so we're looking at screaming, he has understood the impact of screaming the F word, so we're looking at screaming as growth, and I'm going to go and congratulate him for that growth and then continue to work on him with the volume of his voice in the hallways. But really focusing on I'm going to acknowledge the growth that you're showing right now, even though the student still wasn't exactly where I think a lot of the adults wanted that student to be. Celebrating creative resolutions and interventions that teachers are coming up with. I was at a school recently who has a tendency to put students on point sheets when they're really struggling. And I think that's a great intervention, and this one teacher acknowledged that that wasn't going to be a good intervention for a certain student. And so she kind of designed her own very special point sheet that she called a glow chart. And she talked with her staff members about the fact that one of the reasons, based on the conversation she'd had with the student, she was led to believe that one of the reasons the students was really struggling academically and with some behaviors was because the student had very low self-worth. And so she wanted teachers, instead of rating the student on a set number of goals, to simply just tell the student, and in writing, something they did really well that day, whether it was as small as being here. But that student, she decided, really just needed glows. They just needed to hear positive things about their day and about the way people around them were perceiving them. And so she shared that with the rest of the staff, and I think it really triggered, for a lot of the staff, it really helped them, I shouldn't say triggered, inspired a lot of the staff to kind of come up with some other students that same creative intervention might work for, and then also to maybe think more creatively when developing interventions for students that were really struggling in class. I think we need to celebrate when we have educators acknowledging the role that race or their own behavior is playing in decision making, or in the escalating of student behavior. And so, for example, if you have an educator that admits in some sort of restorative conversation with a student that, I've really escalated this by demanding eye contact with you when that isn't culturally appropriate, I would take the time then to celebrate that and to publicly talk about that and commend that teacher for that among other staff members, so that you're really encouraging staff to take that level of accountability and encouraging that level of comfort in talking about race and talking about cultural differences in restorative work. I think having restorative champions, so just like success stories that you can talk about of things that certain teachers are trying in their classrooms, or a student-teacher relationship that's been repaired, or a family that's really been involved in restorative work, and just celebrating those people as much as possible. And then, like we said, just this simple idea of greeting students, staff, and families as they arrive every day can be really powerful, both as a way to just show the importance of relationships, but also just as a way to really check in with students and staff and families as they come into the building every day. Like I said, the middle school that we work with, that has something that they created as part of their systems. And so it's a regular kind of like teacher duty assignment, the same way like monitoring lunch might be. A regular assignment for a teacher would be, you're in charge of greeting students at this door from this time to this time in the morning, or from this time to this time after school. And so there are other ways to kind of build this restorative language and culture into the systems of your school. And so I wanted to provide a couple other examples that I've seen in some of the buildings I've worked in, and some of the other examples that are highlighted in our implementation guide. A middle school that I work with, their restorative practices coordinator has started doing what she calls restorative challenges, where every month she comes up with a different challenge to kind of get students out there building community with other students that they don't know and with other staff members. And so, for example, she does one every year where they participate in a random acts of kindness challenge to see how many random acts of kindness students can complete. And she somehow coordinates it to go along with March Madness, and so there's some sort of a competition for students to kind of move along in this bracket around being kind. And similarly, I saw another school, for every random act of kindness, students would write it on a piece of paper, and they were making kind of one of those paper chains, with the goal being that it would wrap around the school building by the end of the month. And so students participating in coming up with their random acts of kindness, writing them down, getting to be part of like building this chain that goes around the school building. Caught in the act is another thing that I've seen in a couple schools. The idea being that you're caught in the act of doing something positive. So rather than focusing attention on calling out students for negative behaviors, it's focusing on how do you call students out for the positive that they're doing in a school building. And so, for example, if you see, one student having trouble getting into their locker and another student is helping them, there would be a way that you could kind of report that so that it would be celebrated as, a student upholding one of the school values. Cultural assemblies, I think, are a great example of helping kind of bridge that level of uncomfort or discomfort that people frequently have in having conversations about cultural differences and about race. And so figuring out ways that you can celebrate the different races and cultures that are represented in your school building. And then participating in already existing national campaigns. I think frequently a lot of these things feel like a pretty big undertaking, like coming up with this caught in the act system and how it's going to manage and who's in charge of it and how are we celebrating those students, or a cultural assembly can be a fairly big undertaking that typically falls on just a couple people's shoulders in a building. But there are plenty of already existing national campaigns that typically come with a lot of resources. And so Anti-Bullying Month, LGBTQ Pride Month, Dignity in Schools campaign does a national week of action to combat school pushout every year. And so something that's very specifically focused on the school to prison pipeline and very directly addresses some of the racial disparities that we see in school discipline. It's just a great example of some already existing things that are out there that already have resources provided for you to be able to use. And so that being said, hopefully that gives people kind of a general overview of what we're talking about when we think about restorative language and culture, and then also some strategies and how you can really intentionally build that in your school. And so I'll turn it over to Dwana, and we will take some questions from people.
Thanks so much, Allison. So for those of you who are online, either on your computer or using your smartphone, you have a few options. You can either raise your hand. There should be a little icon for you to raise your hand. That will signal to me that you have a question. And then I may be able to unmute you, or you can type your question. There's also a question box. You can type it in there, or you can also type your question in chat. If you are just calling in from your cell phone and there's no way for me to even see you or unmute you, you can send me a text message, and then I can also read your text message and we can answer it on the webinar. And as we're waiting to see if we have some questions, I just want to go over a few things that Allison mentioned that we will also send out. That video, if you haven't seen it yet, of Joe Walden, who's a social worker at Skinner Middle School, and his greeting students every morning. We will send that out along with the sentence stems that we sent out after the last webinar. We can send them out again. We can send out the social justice phrase guide from Advancement Project. I talked about the elimination of some types of words that we are using that do have a negative connotation, and then also some information about dignity in schools.
And as we're waiting, it also came to me what PAWS stands for. It's the Peace and Wellness Space, and that was used in an elementary school as a place that students could go if they needed to take a break or if they needed support in resolving a conflict that they were having with another student or with a staff member.
So we do have a couple of questions. So one question is, what resources are available to assist schools as they tackle race questions and discussions? That is a really great question. I'll talk very briefly that Allison may have some other ideas. And so when we talk about restorative justice, we often talk about how this is not the only thing you should be doing, right? If you are really trying to actually be intentional about having these courageous conversations around race, there does need to be other training, other tools that are provided to folks, because these are conversations that we typically do not have, and they are uncomfortable for people. Allison said earlier something that I know a lot of people wrote down about race being a muscle that needs to be exercised. We don't talk about race often, and so when we do have conversations, they are often uncomfortable. And I feel like this is a personal opinion, we spend a lot of time trying to make people comfortable instead of really thinking about the only way to grow is actually to spend some time being uncomfortable. And so we recommend other trainings, right? And so training on bias. You know, there's implicit bias training. I feel like in some spaces we are kind of past that, right? People are being very explicit with racism and racist language and actions. And so there's also trainings on anti-racism. And so how do I, not become an actor in a racist system? Like, what are the things that I need to do? How do I actually acknowledge what exists within me and make sure that I'm not making decisions based on some of those biases that I hold? Obviously, if you are really implementing restorative justice with fidelity, there's less room for bias to actually creep in because you are looking at human beings as individuals. However, that is not enough alone. And so I believe in the guide, we do talk about other trainings and other professional development opportunities that go along with that. I know we definitely talked about it in our last webinar on creating staff buy-in and ownership. We listed some of the other trainings that would be useful to folks if they want to have these conversations about race. Allison, did you want to add anything?
The only thing I can say is that the schools that I've seen that are in the very early stages of starting to have those conversations have had a lot of success if the conversation is always rooted in data. And so, for example, like having like staff-wide conversations about disparities in discipline, like showing the data has really helped get people talking about numbers. And like Juana said, I'm not sure we should always be like so concerned about people's comfort levels in these conversations, but it definitely has improved comfort levels. And then also when talking specifically to a teacher about race, being able to point to the fact that, like, I've noticed you have sent 3 Black females to the office this week, having the data to back that up, to be able to say, like, how is this something that we can support you in kind of connecting with this part of our school community better. But yeah, otherwise I don't have any like specific trainings other than those that Dwana recommended.
Okay, our next question, do students ever take advantage of being in the peace room where it becomes a nice place to hang out, and how do schools address this? And in my experience, I have never seen students take advantage of the peace room. I have seen not only students but also educators use the peace room. A lot of times the peace room is staffed by someone. And so I've seen young people come in and say, you know, I just need 5 minutes. And they literally sit there for 5 minutes, they calm down, and then they go back to class. Sometimes, you know, there is someone there that checks in with them to make sure that they are okay. Like I've been in a peace room where a young man walked in. There was just a quick check-in, like, are you doing all right? Yes, I just need a little while to get myself together. And then as soon as he got himself together, he walked back to class. But I think the peace room, again, when we're thinking about, you know, how do we create like a restorative culture, it is not just focused on the young people, because adults also need time to calm down and need a time away and may need to, you know, get themselves together for a few minutes. And so the peace room is also a place where they can go and feel safe as well. Allison, have you ever seen a situation where people have taken advantage of the peace room?
I would say the only time I saw something that might have been perceived as a student taking advantage, it ended up pointing to a concern of they were always seemed to be down there during third period, for example, and that pointed to the fact that, you know, they needed the teacher, their third period teacher needed support in building a relationship with them. And so the only times I've ever seen students kind of like overusing that space was when they didn't have a strong relationship with their teacher during that class period. And then I echo what Dwana said about, you know, adults using those spaces, or also I worked recently with she was a teacher coach in a school who talked a lot about that as adults we can also model for students what taking breaks looks like. And, you know, she talked about some of her own experiences in the classroom where like she would feel herself, you know, we all get there with like your face kind of turning red and she's kind of getting angry and talking faster and getting worked up. And so she would model for her students, I'm going to step outside into the hallway and take a couple deep breaths and I'll be back in a couple minutes. And I hope that you guys do the same when you're starting to feel the way that I'm feeling. And so I also think that there's really a lot of power in educators using those spaces as just a way to model for students what taking a break can look like and what it can accomplish.
Okay. Another question. When you go through the restorative chat and questions with two students, and one student gives an example of how they can make things right on his part, but the other student does not see how they can make it right or be accountable, what are some strategies for moving forward? So I think part of the restorative questions allows for people to tell their story, right? And so this should not be a space where we are being critical of the story that they tell. We are listening and allowing them the space to tell their story. And so if I hit Allison, and you know I hit her, but my story is not about that, right? It's still mine, right? And I think that's why, for those of you who have gone through the training, you have probably heard the saying that, you know, no one can argue with your story. You may be able to argue with my opinion, but you cannot argue with my story. My story is mine. Because often in those stories, what you are also trying to get to when we think about behavior as communication, as an expression of need, is actually what is the root cause of that behavior and how do we uncover that? And the way we often do that is through storytelling. So I may get to a place where I admit that I hit Allison, but the important part is what kind of led me there. And I think that's why the other questions kind of help. So it's not just, you know, why did you do this thing that you did, but actually what was happening, what was going on, what was I thinking about, because you actually are then getting to the heart of what happened. And those questions are harder also to answer, right? They require some level of thought. They sometimes require some silence. And so it's also about us being patient with young people, because we often don't ask them questions like that either. The very easy question that we ask is, why did you do that? And the answer that they give is that they don't know. And sometimes they really don't know, because sometimes we're doing things and we're not necessarily thinking about why we're doing them. And so I would encourage folks to kind of just have some patience with that. It is a different way of communication. And it's this different form of communication, but also the reminder that, you know, all of this work is an invitation. It is voluntary, that you cannot force this on people. And then the idea, especially if you're using a circle, it's that you shouldn't walk into it having a predetermined outcome, that it goes where it goes. But I know, you know, we often, when we think about accountability and what needs to happen and how it ends up, and, you know, Allison was talking about earlier that idea that the end is always an apology, right? We may not get there because that is not how the circle goes, or that is not how the conversation goes. And so being restorative also means kind of letting go of that idea that there are certain outcomes and expectations that are necessary in order for us to feel like people are being held accountable. Being held accountable is, you know, having to hear how you hurt someone else, and then, you know, having a conversation with that individual about what they need to feel whole, and then what you need to move forward. And so it's not about punishment or about, you know, I have to do this thing in order for everyone to be okay, but what is it that person who was harmed need, and then what are my needs that led to that behavior? Allison?
Yeah, I would echo what you said too about just like a lot of times our students are not used to being asked that question, and so it's definitely skill building and capacity building for them. And so one thing I have found effective is that, like, sometimes the reason why the student can't think of how they're going to repair the harm is because it's not a skill that they have it's not something that they've been asked to do before. And so I've been working with a couple elementary schools where, in order to make sure we're implementing restorative practices with fidelity, we obviously don't want to be giving students consequences or assigning the student the consequence or the way that they should be repairing harm in the community. And so instead, we've been experimenting with, like, what if we give students categories to pick from, and then they develop the specific way they would repair. And so it's all student choice, and it's something we're definitely still experimenting with, like how is this actually working as far as implementation goes. But teachers are working on they're calling it, I think, a menu of repair. And it gives a couple categories, like help an adult, help another student, improve our classroom environment, and kind of like broad categories like that, where the adult can kind of scaffold for the student, like what it's like to kind of, now that I've understood the impact that my behavior has had, help that guide what I then choose to do as a way to repair the harm that I've caused to this community. And so, you know, if walking through those questions, having that restorative conversation, the student expresses that they feel like they have harmed an adult in the building, maybe they're kind of thinking like, okay, I want to help. I think my repair should be around helping an adult, and kind of really scaffolding that process for students. I think the hard part there is without dictating what that is for students and making sure that it's still voluntary.
Great, thank you. So Allison, what does CFOR stand for? Someone missed that.
So it's concern. So first you say, like, I am worried about the way that you're talking to me. Then it's feeling. It makes me feel upset. Ownership. I can take responsibility for the fact that I've talked to you that way in the past. And then a request. So I ask of you that you no longer speak to me that way. And so it's concern, feeling, ownership, request. And the school that was working with this was actually a pretty unique alternative school up in the mountains in Colorado called Eagle Rock. And it was one of the first things that they did with students as part of their onboarding, with the idea being that we need you to be communicating your needs. And so this is a very concrete way to communicate any concerns that you're having and needs that you might have from adult staff members or from your fellow students. And so it was part of like the onboarding process for students, and then staff also used that same language. And so I'll repeat it one more time. It's concern, feeling, ownership, request.
Thank you, Allison. Okay. How can our conversations encourage safer places to risk and practice the level of vulnerability that lead to empathy? That's a really beautiful question.
Yes.
And so I think, like, if you're sitting in circle, if you're keeping circle, then obviously, you know, wanting to be able, like, a core piece of that is wanting to make the space safe enough that will allow for people to become vulnerable. And then I think it's a matter of the questions that you're asking. And so you can keep circles where you are having intentional conversations about race, you know, asking certain questions to get people talking about their own experiences. I know the book Circle Forward has a number of sample circle outlines that will allow for some of that sharing to happen. But there's so much work, right, that you need to do before you actually get into, right, like, how does race affect your life? If you come into a circle and, you know, after your opening and your check-in, the very first thing that you're being asked is a question about race, then you're probably actually not safe enough to answer that question yet. And so when you know that you want to be in a space where you do want to have these intentional conversations about race, a lot of that is about what is the pre-work and what is the work that is being done, you know, on a consistent basis that will allow people to just feel closer to each other. And so by the time you actually have that conversation about race, I am in community with you, I know you, I understand you, and I'm willing to hear your story. And that is so important. And there is that balance there, right? A lot of times I'm a big believer of, you know, so, you know, at the moment there are children and individuals suffering, and we need to, you know, act faster, and we need to have these conversations. These conversations are important to have, and we can't just wait until people are comfortable. We have to move. But when you're ready to have them, though, like, what is it that we're doing to make sure that the space is actually safe? So when I do say something, when I talk about how maybe racism has affected me, you were able to hear that and not judge me. And I'm also able to hear your response. And that doesn't mean that at some point the space may not feel unsafe, right? Because, again, if we're talking about growing and we want people to grow, then that will mean that there will be levels and there will be times where people are uncomfortable, and that is necessary for growth. But what is it that we've done on the front end to make sure that we can actually come together to be able to have that conversation in the first place? And so that is where the community building circles, you know, getting to know people, circles maybe without a specific topic, where you're just sitting with each other. So when it comes time to have those conversations that do require an intense level of safety and another level of vulnerability, we're actually able to do that. Allison, did you want to add something?
No, I agree.
Okay. So someone also had a recommendation about a really good book to read called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, which was said to be a good book for a book study. I know there was a question earlier about, like, how do we actually have these conversations about race, or what other kind of resources were available to talk about it. And then we have another question. Are there some restorative justice practices language terms that need to be adapted or changed for certain age or racial groups? Any examples that you can share? So I would, so one of the things that we've done, or, you know, I think that we've tried to do is adapt. I wouldn't say based on race. I mean, I think there are some terms that we use with our little ones that we may not use with all children. And so, for example, if you are creating values with your classroom community, then you know, if you're tiny, then you may not know what values mean, right? And so, like, how do we actually get that out of folks without using, like, the language that we use? And so one thing could be, what is something that you really like about your best friend? And that could be, like, the values, like, asking the question that way could be a way that we actually arrive at the same thing, but we're just asking it differently. I think we've also shared in the past pictures. I think this also could go back to something that Allison was talking about earlier, when we're thinking about, okay, well, how do we actually repair harm? And we sometimes may not have the language for it. And some of our nonverbal learners as well. How can we use pictures to get to that? And so that's also something that we can send out. as the restorative questions and pictures that go along with it. And I have seen that used with both our little children and also students who may be nonverbal, so they are choosing how they are pointing at a picture of how they feel, pointing at a picture of who they may have harmed, pointing at a picture of, you know, what they're going to do to repair the harm, instead of asking the question. I would also really encourage folks, especially when you're creating values and guidelines, to use the language that the young people offer. And so if you're working with young people, when we talk about, you know, not talking when someone else is talking, respecting the talking pieces, those things, their language is very different. You know, I'm fortunate enough to work with a lot of high school children. And so when we come to values, right, they use things like one mic, you know, don't yuck my yum. And I'm not editing what they're saying, because that is the language in which they communicate with each other. Because it's also really important for folks to see themselves reflected in the values that they create, and that we're not kind of censoring that based on our adult interpretation of that, that we are actually using the words that they offer. And so I think, you know, if we are being really inclusive in the space, and we do believe that circles are a way where everyone is equal, the way they actually talk about things and the way they describe things is just as important as the way we do. And so making sure that that is captured and seen for them as well. Allison, do you want to?
No, I just want to echo what you were talking about, just like authentically giving students voice. You know, I was working with some educators recently around the idea of having students set their own classroom guidelines using Circle. And like the questions I was essentially getting was, how do I get them to suggest the guidelines that I've already created for this classroom? And just that acknowledgement of they didn't create them if you're already going in with a list of guidelines that you're hoping that they come up with in that space.
Okay, so I don't see any additional questions. These were all really great questions. Thank you, everyone. And I don't see anyone's hand raised. And so, again, so we will send out the video of Joe, the Social Justice Phrase Guide, information around DSC. We'll send out the document with some of the pictures that are associated with the restorative questions, the sentence stems from our last webinar, and would also encourage folks, if you are thinking about other professional development opportunities that may go along with restorative justice, to have a look at our last webinar, because Allison actually spent, you know, quite a bit of time kind of talking about that. There's some really great information in there as well. Before we leave, though, want to have Allison read us a closing before we depart.
Great. So this is from an essay called "The Power of Language: A Philosophical Sociological Reflection." The power of language shows itself not only and not primarily in the language of power, of overpowering and repression, but also in its emancipatory potential, in the opening of other and new possibilities of speaking, and so also of thinking and acting. All speech inevitably refers to a possible contradiction, every yes to a possible no, every assertion to a possible doubt.
Thank you, Allison, and thank all of you for really joining. We will begin again after the holidays, and so I hope all of you have a beautiful holiday season. Allison, do you want to say anything?
No, just thank you, and excited to see everyone virtually again in January.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a beautiful night.
Bye.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks.